This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Welcome to this episode of Plain Talk Live. I'm Rob Port, and happy to be with you. I got a special guest today. Former North Dakota Congressman Earl Pomeroy is going to be joining us in a second. In fact, I'll just go ahead and put him on right now. There's his happy, smiling face, and happy to be having a conversation with him today. And Congressman, first of all, thanks for your time. Thanks for doing this with me.
Well, Rob, I appreciated the invitation. I recall the memo on the email when you first reached out, and it said, a crazy idea. And he went on to discuss how, well, maybe it's a crazy idea to think that the two guys coming from different parts of the philosophical spectrum can sit and have a nice visit. But I was intrigued, and I thought, yeah, I think we don't have enough of that going on these days. I appreciated the invite. I really did.
We did, and I've actually got to share an anecdote. I don't know at all if you remember this. I've been doing this for almost 20 years now, writing. But back when I think it was 2006, but I had only been doing this for a few years, and to be honest with you, nobody was reading at that point. I think my mother was reading at that point, and that's about it. But I actually ran into you at the airport in Minneapolis. Now, people who aren't from North Dakota don't realize when you get to the airport in Minneapolis and you get to that gate going home to North Dakota, it's like reunion week, right? You see all sorts of people, you know. And so I had a kind of a late connecting flight, and I'd been hustling down, and I got in line because they already had the line up to take the tickets or take the boarding passes and everything to get on the next flight home into Minot. And I got in, and who should be standing right in front of me but Earl Pomeroy? And I'm standing there because I'm probably like maybe 24 hours removed from probably writing something pretty critical about you at that point. So I'm standing there, and all of a sudden you turn around and you hand me. You said, "Hey, they always give me these first class upgrades, but I never like to do them. Do you want to sit in first class?" And at that point, I'm just kind of like, okay, I wasn't thinking at all, so I took it and I sat in Earl Pomeroy's first class seat from Minneapolis to Minot one time. You probably don't remember that at all, but that was me.
I don't recall it doing me any good with you thereafter, but
yeah. As in terms of a bribe, it didn't work very well, I suppose.
Darn it.
And I'll tell you, it's funny because, I am scrupulous about that stuff. No, I don't donate to political parties. I don't go to people's events. I don't do any of that stuff. And not that I was a 26-year-old kid and was just like, what is happening right now? I'm going to sit in the congressman's airplane seat. So that was pretty funny. What do you think? We live in interesting political times, and I think in any historical era, you can look at it and say, well, there's nothing new under the sun. Everything has happened again. We've been through everything again, but this feels pretty unique to me. The situation that we're in. I think the situation that Republicans are in, where they have this very populist movement within it. That has really taken over the party. I think it's fair to say I don't think it's unfair to say that it's Donald Trump's party right now, based on political polling and a lot of other factors. That's happening with Republicans. In the meantime, Democrats in a lot of ways have completely lost touch with very large geographical swaths of this country. I don't think that's unfair to say either. And so we have this situation where Republicans are adhering to a very polarizing sort of politics, and Democrats are in a way in that there's not a lot of signs. I think for a voter from North Dakota looking for something to vote for, at least in the National Democratic Party, is finding it hard to find things to vote for. I guess is the point I'm trying to make. Do you view it the same way, or is this just right wing Rob seeing things.
So, you say that we've never seen anything like this before. Well, the last article I was reading was going back to the Roman Senate and discussing the fall of the Roman Empire as having some direct application to the days we're in. I would certainly hope not, but I've never seen anything like this. It's gotten worse. Now it's an old, it's just such a cliche to say, oh, geez, it keeps getting worse and worse. What I see in the political debate, though, now, Rob, and it really disturbs me a lot, is, are we committed to the foundation, the principles of democracy, where, you have fair and free elections, you count the votes, there's a winner, there's a loser. Disputes are taken into the judicial system, the place where in this country we resolve questions of fact and questions of law. And it seems to me that we're in a period of time where that's all it's all a game. And the key is just to win and win no matter what. And so this traditional count the votes, if you got a question, take it to court, that's kind of by the boards, and it's just hold on to power however you can. I hate that. I really do hate that. Now, what about the left? Well, there's a lot of people on the left I have strenuous disagreement with. I think they are singularly responsible for a disappointing night on election night below the presidential for the Democratic Party, because this socialist agenda, and let's face it, Bernie Sanders, the guy has been very clear about his convictions. He was a Democratic socialist. That's how he wanted to appear on a Vermont ballot, and he has an agenda that really I think is off kilter relative to mainstream Democrats and what we want to offer the country. So I've got some trouble on the left as well. I would note that Biden was, in my opinion, the most centrist of the field, and was the one that came through this kind of bruising primary period. I think he's doing a pretty good job in the early going, trying to address an awful lot of problems and address them very quickly. So that's kind of where we're at. But I'd love to have the debate just involve, philosophy, political differences, strategic differences in terms of how, as a country, we should proceed. I feel this debate's slipping into, do we adhere to democracy? Are we moving away from democracy as we've known it? And I really am a little concerned about that.
To that point, because I agree with you, we could have a debate all day long about what you just said about whether Joe Biden's off to a good start or not, and I disagree, which you may not be surprised to learn. But one interesting thing you said, because you kind of listed like a lot of the, and I think you were spot on with all of them, where you're talking about the underpinnings of democracy, and to me, one of the underpinnings of democracy is acknowledging that sometimes the other people get to govern. Right. I mean, sometimes you lose the election, the other people get to be in charge.
I've got some expertise in this. You lose some elections,
Yeah. So and then
it's done. It's the other guy's turn. You take it to it's the people's government.
I remember on because one thing I started my writing career during the Bush administration, and one thing that I didn't like in that era was I would hear people say, "Well, he's not my president." And that drove me nuts, because not that I expected everybody to agree with everything he did. I didn't agree with everything he did, but he was our president. He won the election fair and square. He's the president, right? And the Republican majorities are the Republican majorities. The Democratic majorities during his 8 years in office with the Democratic majorities, they get to govern. I remember the night that Barack Obama won his first term in office in 2008. I think I was on the radio when the calls were coming in, and he was being, and I was on with Scott Hennon, who we both know. And I remember saying that night, he's my president. He won the election. He's my president. And he's going to do a lot of things that I'm not going to like, and I'm going to criticize, and I'm going to do the best I can to resist those things, because I think they're bad policies. But he's my president. And so to bring this all, one thing that's alarming to me is that unwillingness to allow the other side to govern, knowing they're going to do some things you don't like, and they may even do some things that you think are going to be harmful, but at some point, like, that's what democracy depends on. the other side has to be able to govern. They have to have the confidence that if they win the election, they get to govern. And I don't. Clearly, I do not like Donald Trump. But when he won the election in 2016, it was weeks after the election that people were already talking about impeaching him. And that, to me, I thought was terrible. Do you agree? You got to let the other side govern.
You do. Absolutely. There was a clown in the House that had a bill in within 24 hours or something. I mean, it was ridiculous. I don't even know if the inauguration had taken place. I guess the people govern. There are elections. There are outcomes we're thrilled with. There are outcomes we're horrified with. But that's just the way it goes. And what I think that we're on a track now, well, it looks this way. You go to court in 60 different jurisdictions and you come out 0 for 60 relative to was there voting fraud that tipped this election. To me, that ought to just be the end of it. I think it's more gracious to declare on election night, but they've strong feelings about voter fraud, take it to court. But when you get swept in court to then try and take it into the political arena and rig the outcome that you lost to try and win by throwing out enough of the other guy's votes, this is bad business. This really is tinkering with the very notion that the people govern.
Well, it's kind of the other side of the coin to trying to impeach President Trump. I mean, Republicans are doing the same thing as the resistance did back when it was Donald Trump. In that, they're trying to overturn the election. I mean, just over the Memorial Day weekend, we had Sidney Powell at one time, and maybe still is. Sometimes it's hard to tell how much influence these people have with Trump himself. But she's out there, spreading the idea that Trump's going to somehow, through some bizarre mechanism, is somehow going to be restored to office this August, which is ridiculous. You have Michael Flynn, former national security advisor to Donald Trump, literally a cabinet level person at one time. He didn't last very long there, but he somebody gets up and say, well, why can't what happened in Myanmar happen here? As if what happened in Myanmar was a positive thing. But you have Michael Flynn saying, oh yeah, it should happen here. And that's not the first. I mean, he talked about having a do-over of the national election run by the military. So, I mean, how is that not the exact same thing that drove Trump supporters nuts, and perhaps rightfully so, when they were talking about impeaching the guy before he'd even done anything? But here, they don't even want to admit that Joe Biden won the election.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's even worse than the impeachment, because at least the impeachment still came down to a legal process, and you counted the votes. Now, those that were screaming about impeaching before the governing started, well, that's a very bad thing, and they're not accepting the outcome of the election, which is terribly important. The people govern, but this business, I think we're in a time where there's an awful lot of money to be made by people. I'm not going to single out Sidney Powell, but people that are preserving the myth that somehow this election can be overturned and Donald Trump restored as president. They do that in the face of 0 to 60 in terms of trial court outcomes, and a Supreme Court ruling that included the dismissal of an action that North Dakota decided to participate in, laughed it right off the courthouse steps. Didn't even consider it. But that ought to put an end to things. We have the legislative branch, we have the executive branch, we have plenty of places for them to fight back and forth all day long, and that's called the checks and balances, because we're going to concentrate power somewhere. And once in a while, there's questions of law that have to be tried by the judiciary, and that's their role. They call the balls and the strikes. And that's not, they want to take, essentially, and a lot of the legislation pending in state courts seem to go this way. They want to take the judiciary out of it and just have it fixed between these two. And you can't have a politically determined outcome to an election. The voters have to determine by vote counts. Believe me, I've been involved in some heartbreaking losses. First, right out of college, Rob, I worked in the Bill Guy for Senate campaign. He got beat by 160 votes out of 214,000 cast. We had a left-wing candidate draw off something like 10,000 votes and seal the deal. The same thing happened in 2000 with Ralph Nader taking just enough votes from Al Gore so that George Bush became president. Went up to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court ruled. And Al Gore comes on television and basically says it's over. That's really how the system works. And we want to have, I think we had a point now, Rob, where you're not a real Republican if you accept the outcome of the 2020 election.
Oh,
and of course,
me.
That's just really a perversion of what this is all about.
Trust me, I get that now because I accepted the outcome. Joe Biden won, and I think it's fair. I mean, I don't know that we've had a national election where you couldn't drill down to some precincts or some counties or whatever where they had some problems. Of course, you're talking about tens and tens of millions of votes. Of course, that's going to happen. The problem is that, exactly right. I mean, I'm getting called, again, almost 20 years into a career as a pretty consistent conservative. I'm now being called a communist. Because, for Donald Trump. And that's one thing that really scares me about the conservative movement right now is I felt, and I think it was for a long time, a movement that was coalesced around ideas. And obviously there were spokespeople for those ideas that were particularly good, that we championed, people like Ronald Reagan, people like Milt Friedman, people like William F. Buckley, but it wasn't about them per se. It was about the ideas. And now what I'm afraid of is we've reached a point where it's not about ideas. It's about a person. And I think that's a dangerous thing because let's face it, Donald Trump's not conservative in a lot of ways. He's not. He's a free spender. He's not particularly socially conservative, if that's important to you. But he's a personality that people like, and for a lot of people, that's all that matters.
Well, the history is very instructive on this. When a personality cult moving into an autocratic form, not a democratic form of government. Just take what you said about Myanmar and General Flynn saying, God, we ought to be like Myanmar. Contrast that with Ronald Reagan, the modern day unquestioned leader of the conservative movement, and we basically changed the direction of the country. How did he do it? He talked about the United States being a city on a hill, a functional democracy to the world, where the fight for freedom taking place in these dark corners of the globe would always be able to look to the United States as the city on a hill. And Ronald Reagan's words. And to have a senior leader on the right, someone very close to Trump, pardoned by Trump, talk about, we ought to be like Myanmar on the military coup. That is as far as we can come from the Ronald Reagan example, the example of so many leaders on either the right or the left. Bottom line, we have all adhered to the principles of democracy. And I believe that that's been called into question now more than any time in my lifetime, and it's very worrisome.
And it's not because we're doing a lot of Republican and Trump bashing here, and rightfully so, because I feel like they deserve it. But it's everywhere. Because we could go back on a timeline here. I remember you're talking about the disputed 2000 election. I remember watching those election results come in because my oldest daughter was actually born as they were still. I remember watching the recounts on television in the hospital while my daughter was being born. And by the way, I voted for Al Gore in that election, if you could believe that. I was 20-year-old kid, didn't know what I was doing, so I grew up a little bit, made some money, became a Republican. But I remember Democrats talking about, in much the same way that I hear Republicans today talking about Dominion voting machines and everything else. I remember Democrats talking about Diebold voting machines and some Diebold, because I guess they had at the time, maybe they still do, I don't know, they had made some of the voting machines in Florida, and some of the Diebold executives had made political contributions to Republican candidates, and from that sprouted this great conspiracy theory that was never as mainstream as the Dominion stuff and everything that's going on in Trump world was on the right. but it was there. And I mean, I look back and the roots of a lot of what we're dealing with now, we're back then, and maybe it goes back even further. And I'm not trying to say that one side's worse about this than the other, but we've been doing it to each other for so long. I don't know how we stop. Right? I mean, it's almost like it's like an arms race, and at some point somebody just has to stop and trust that the other side's going to stop too.
Yeah, I'll hand another example to you. 1960, very close election, Kennedy-Nixon, and there will always be those who think the election was stolen in Chicago by Mayor Daley, delivering enough votes so that Illinois tipped for Kennedy and swung the election. Certainly, Richard Nixon, I believe that till his dying day. Believe me, I've got no truck with either side playing with election results. I think the elections is almost a sacred part of our democracy, where control of the world's greatest democracy in the 21st century, a country of extraordinary 350 million people, could not be more complicated. And it all comes down to election day, and the people get to decide what happens next. I mean, that is a cherished principle and completely at odds with how China runs itself, how Russia runs itself, how tin horn dictators down in Latin America run their countries. And it has been the key to the city on a hill. We must adhere to it. And because you think that an election result, as determined by the courts, has been concluded, whether or not it was concluded the way you like, because you think we ought to go along with the election results, that certainly doesn't make you less of a conservative or less of a Republican. I would say that the conservative principle ought to be the tenets of democracy.
Well,
we have elections, and we live with the outcome.
And obviously not just a conservative principle, that should be an American principle, right?
Exactly.
It's not right or left. It's, well, I fought hard and I made my argument and not enough people agreed with me and it was a tough election and I'm heartbroken, but you know what? They get to govern for a while. And the beautiful thing about the system is there's always another election coming. And if you didn't win this one, hey, maybe you can win the next one. A big part of this, I'm afraid, and I don't know, I've been big on this idea of there being a sort of cultural balkanization in our society, which is, and I feel like a lot of it is driven by our most dominant cultural institutions. So you think the news media, academia, the entertainment industry, these are not places, as speaking from a right of center point of view, these are not places that are very welcoming to people who have my point of view, right? I mean, even setting the Trump stuff aside, I remember when Paul Ryan, who, agree with him or disagree with him, I think is an honorable man, former Speaker of the House. I remember when he wanted to reform Medicare and we're running ads, making fun of him because he wanted to push old people off a cliff and all these terrible things. These are not welcoming, and what I'm worried is that, because I think in some ways conservatives are doing to itself. Like when we talk about, you turn on Fox News and you hear them talk about the mainstream media all day, how the most watched cable network in the country is somehow not mainstream is bizarre to me. I mean, of course you're mainstream, but we're doing it to ourselves, right? Where we've sort of, okay, well, the New York Times and the LA Times and all these, they're all liberal. And so we're alternative, we're conservative media, and maybe that's fine, and maybe that's healthy. And hell, I was a part of that. But the problem is we now just sort of ghettoized ourselves, right? They're mainstream, and I guess by definition we're not mainstream. And now we've created this little bubble for ourselves where we're not talking to the other side anymore. We're just talking to ourselves. And the things that make sense to us when we're not really getting any input from the other side, or the only input we're getting from the other side is sort of filtered through all these biases. I think that's the sort of hothouse environment that Trump didn't create, but took advantage of. That's something that really troubles me about conservatives right now.
You made a choice, Rob, at one point, and you started out as a conservative. 20 years later, you're a conservative. you haven't budged, by my view, in terms of your philosophical approach to issues and the rest of it. Um, Now you look at someone. There are other personalities. I'll single one out. I think Tucker Carlson has moved all over the place, and the ratings have responded fabulously for him. But he's not the guy with the bow tie that used to kind of opine like some smart kid out of Georgetown or something. He's now leading the culture wars and bringing on outrageous guests, which he further provokes with his inflammatory questions. And it's all been great for ratings and great for Tucker Carlson. And it's unfortunately really seeped into the national debate. It's coursing the debates. You've got families ticked off at each other within the families. And it's all gone downhill a long ways. And I believe at least a component of it is media companies chasing profits through ratings achieved by annoying the hell out of their listeners about the issue under discussion, so they come back and watch it tomorrow, so they get annoyed again. Yeah. And you've not played that game.
But doesn't that say? Well, you're kind of making it sound like I don't have any audience, which I do. I do, but I will tell you, I know for a fact I could probably be a heck of a lot. And listen, I have never aspired to really anything more than the exact job that I have right now. I love North Dakota. I am a North Dakota first guy. I love my home, and this is all I've ever really wanted to do. I don't want to go any higher because I think what lays beyond there is, there be dragons, right? I don't want to go there. I like North Dakota. But if I was willing to just sort of sell out and say whatever I got paid to say, or say whatever was going to wind people up that day, I could be a lot further along, probably, but I just don't want to be that person. I'm not interested in being that
I
person.
acknowledge you've made that decision, and I admire you for it.
But what about what does it say about us though that work? Because I think that's an interesting thing where it's media companies seeking profit, but obviously they're seeking profit by delivering the public what the public wants, right? And also I think it works the same way in politics. Like the example I always use is that Americans generally want low taxes and big government. And I think our politicians have been delivering it and putting it all on the federal credit card, which is why we have a national debt that's zeroing in on $30 trillion. We're giving the people what they want. I think contrary to popular belief, I think a lot of these politicians are very responsive to what the people want. It's just what the people want are completely contradictory things that you can't have. How much of the problem is us? I feel like we're it's the media's fault or it's the politicians' fault. What if we're the problem?
Well, I think there's plenty of blame to go around, and we all have to own our part of it. And that means the electorate has to own its part of it when basically, rather than studying issues and thinking about them, they'll listen to a talk show for half an hour and got it all figured out because somebody told them a line of BS. We have our own responsibilities in this democracy, and we bring in our beliefs, fair enough, but then let's study the issues and get the facts. I think we've fallen a little short on that. Now, politicians, they have their responsibility. It's called leadership. And remember the moment that John McCain, this woman got up at the town meeting and called Obama, said he was not American or Muslim or something like that. McCain shut her down right then, straightened it out. He said, honorable people with different beliefs can fight it out in a political system, and that's the way we should do business. Instead, we've demonized everybody to a point where we really pull the country apart. In other places, we saw for many years they take Northern Ireland. We could never understand. You have Catholics killing Protestants and Protestants killing Catholics. What? I don't get it. What's that about? Are these places where they have these ethnic wars? Yeah, there was a conquest several hundred years ago, and they're still ticked off about it. And boom, it erupts into another war. That's what happened in the Balkans. And I never could understand it. But what I've seen now is the polarization of political parties to where, just sight unseen, if you have an R versus a D, that you're completely judged by your political affiliation, and people will hate you, literally hate you, just by virtue of knowing your political affiliation. Now, that's getting into the kind of almost ethnic divide that we've seen in these other countries. We've not had it in the United States before, but I really think it's extremely unhealthy for the political system.
Well, that's what I talked about with the cultural balkanization. I mean, that's what I see happening right now. I mean, people. I have friends who know that I'm a Writer Center guy, and they come over and they look at my desk and they see a copy of the New Yorker sitting there, right? And they're like, "What are you doing reading that?" It's like, well, I don't agree with. Well, first of all, I like they publish literature sometimes, short stories, which I really enjoy, but. And a lot of their journalism, I think, is revealing and insightful and often comes to conclusions that I do not agree with at all. But I feel like there's things to be learned from there. I subscribe to The Atlantic, too. I try to expose myself to these things, and for another reason to sharpen my own thinking on it. These have become almost cultural taboos where you're not supposed to do that. And I hear jokes all the time when I talk to North Dakota Democrats, and people say, well, don't let people know that I'm talking to you or whatever, right? And it's like there's some taboo about talking to me. Like I'm just some guy. Just because you talk to me doesn't mean that you don't disagree with me about everything anymore. But it's drilled down to that level where you can't even talk to somebody anymore, and it's what'd you do that for? And even within the North Dakota Republican Party, and this is something, and I don't know how closely you followed this, but there's a divide in the North Dakota Republican Party between what I would say is the traditional North Dakota Republican, who I think is I think you may disagree with this, but I think the reason why North Dakota Republican Party has been as successful as it has been is because for the most part they've been very pragmatic. They've had very pragmatic leaders, and they for the most part governed well. Now, you and I could probably come up with a list of quibbles and things that we don't necessarily like, but in the aggregate, I think they've done a good job, and I think that's why they're winning. Not because they're pursuing some culture war, or they're pursuing ideological purity. I think they've just made very pragmatic decisions to govern the states. They've been responsive to their constituents. They've done a good job. There's a faction of Republicans who want ideological purity now, and if you're either against them, we're either with them or against them, and they're a bigger, I mean, in terms of measuring their in the legislature, they're bigger than the Democratic caucus in the legislature. Right. In a lot of ways, that's the political divide in North Dakota right now.
That won't end well for the Republican Party because most people are not with that hard right. Everything is a national issue. It's like those people spend too much time in front of the television. They get out and walk around the neighborhood, drive down to the corner store, and drive out. They see how the crops are coming up in the field. So they need to get real. Not just sit on that Fox News and get ticked off. And who's their constituency? The voters that are watching Fox News and thinking everything is national.
I wrote a while ago that I don't think those people have constituencies. I think they have audiences, and also like I this whole idea that like government has to enforce my culture for me. I just want government to plow the damn roads, right? I don't need you to like enforce the way that I want to live. I'll take care of that, right? I'll go to my church or I'll go to my civic group. I'll involve myself in the way I raise my children. I'll take care of my culture, right? You plow the damn roads. I'll take care of my culture. That's what I want.
Yeah, well, exactly right. There used to be an old joke about differences between Republicans and Democrats. One of the old saws that I remember is Democrats read pornography. Republicans form censorship committees and read them as a group. We just have to. It's hard for me to understand how a person can say, "I want government out of my life," and then will really want to run a social agenda that's extremely prescriptive and precise, so everyone has to follow the things that they think. I don't go for that, and I don't know. As I get older in life, I think I have a sense of a more limited role for government. relative to certainly in the prescribing, on the social agenda business. I also recognize that there's a lot the government can't do, and it's a fool's errand to try. That would include trying to remake these distant countries into little United States through our blood and treasure, sending our soldiers over indefinitely. That isn't going to work. So, what a person has to do, and I think that our opinions evolve, Rob, when we try to keep an open mind, try to inform ourselves from diverse sources of information, and try and make the best of it as we can. The last thing I want to do is turn on television and have somebody from the left or the right tell me what's going down, how it's going down, why it's going down. I'll figure that out. You just give me the facts. And I think we're a little short on that today.
I think so. One thing, that's one thing that you bring up, like the Trump movement. I think if you could distill it down to policy, and I don't know how much we owe Trump credit for this, or maybe just because I do think he did pick at times some good people to surround himself with. And some of the like for me, it was a big trade issue, right? And I remember during the 2018 election, in our Senate race between Heidi Heitkamp and Kevin Cramer, the trade issue kept coming up, right? And Trump was launching us into a trade war with China, and everybody kept talking about this in the context of how many soybeans can North Dakota export. And to me, I started, because I always subscribed to the idea, and I mean, you could go back and trace this to George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush. There was always this idea that if we had free trade with China, or with regimes like China, that we'd knock the rough edges off, their economic interests would align with ours, and we could get them to moderate, and right? That was sort of the idea. I don't think it's worked, at least not with China. If China's taken trade with us and they've used it as a fuel cell for a horrifically authoritarian regime. They have millions of people in concentration camps, for crying out loud. Now, I used to be a free trader, thinking we'll get to that. We'll trade with them. We'll expose them to our culture. They'll aspire to freedom. It hasn't worked. We got to do something else. And maybe trade sanctions are it. I'm not necessarily endorsing Donald Trump's debate about that, but our policy for China can't be measured in how many soybeans we're going to sell them anymore. I do feel like there was some shift there, especially for Republicans. That was a good thing. Shifting from, sort of the nation-building approach that you just referenced. I was a supporter of the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war, and I think you could even draw a distinction between those missions. Afghanistan, we went there but, looking back, Iraq was a mistake. I was all for it at the time. I supported it. It was a mistake. We shouldn't have done it. I think Republicans have come around on that. I feel like these are positive evolutions for Republicans. I don't know how much credit to give Donald Trump for that, but I think these are, to your point about evolving over time, I think these are positive evolutions for Republicans. I think they're good things.
I think that's right. Let's give the devil his due. I think now, in part, I felt like we gave Vladimir Putin a pass for 4 years. He didn't deserve it. And he's not getting it anymore. That's a good thing. China, we kind of wanted to have it both ways with China. Tough rhetoric and yet unlimited access to their vast market. We also liked their cheap goods coming in. What we've learned, and I came from exactly your point. I thought liberal trade brings liberal governance. Liberal in the context of democratic governance, right. Not liberal conservative.
Yeah, gotcha.
And we were wrong. I was wrong. I think maybe it uniquely is because of this particular leader of China, but they got a tougher state-controlled approach now than they've had in many, many years. So we have to recalibrate quite dramatically, I think, relative to China. What masked over the soybean issue was huge checks from the Commodity Credit Corporation, and so we have a vehicle that can help protect farmers, and the spigot was opened wide relative to government checks. So we got people in our most rural reaches debt against the federal government, cashing those checks as fast as they came in. And it really did, I think, mask what would be the pricing consequence of suddenly losing China to our egg markets. Now, when I was representing North Dakota, I felt like my job was I was one part of a mosaic. The mosaic was the country, and my part was North Dakota. So I tended to view things was if it was good for North Dakota, it was good for the country. And so I still think that you hate to give up on an ag market of 1.3 billion people or whatever it is. Adroit diplomacy, but putting on sustained pressure, begun by President Trump, that we're not just giving China a pass and hoping, in spite of all the evidence, that this is all going to work out. It didn't. Trump began the turn, and Biden's continuing it, and it has to be this way.
Do you feel? Let's switch gears and talk about North Dakota specifically. Your state party just got new leadership. Just held their reorganization and got some new leadership. What do North Dakota Democrats? I feel like they have an opportunity, and the reason why I feel that way is because there's obviously some. I mean, Donald Trump at the national level is very divisive. We just talked about some of the divides within the ND GOP locally. We're not that far removed from when people like you and Kent Conrad and Byron Dorgan were getting 60, 70% of the vote on the statewide ballot, on the same ballot as people like John Hoeven and Wayne Stenhjem, Republicans, right? North Dakotans will vote for Democrats. We're not nearly so partisan a state or frankly, as conservative a state as some people make us out to be. I think that North Dakota Democrats could persuade people to vote for them. Here's the problem that I perceive, though, is because I get all their press releases and everything, and I read them, and they're always talking about these dirty, nasty Republicans who are doing racist, awful, bigoted things, and I'm thinking to myself, if I'm a North Dakotan and I'm whether I consider myself a Republican or maybe an independent who's been voting for a lot of Republicans, Democrats need people who have been voting for Republicans to start voting for Democrats. I don't know how you persuade people who have been voting for Republicans that they've been voting for racists or that they themselves are racist. Now vote for us. I look at the messaging that comes out of your party sometimes, and I'm just scratching my head thinking, how are you going to win over voters in North Dakota who have been casting their ballots for Republicans for a while? How are you going to get them to up and vote for Democrats now? Because I don't see it the way they're going now. But I don't know what you see.
I'm not going to say every political effort we've attempted as a party has been perfectly conceived and perfectly executed. Of course not. On the other hand, I think that we could have been sparkling brilliant or unbelievably bad, and the outcome would be the same in this environment. And what happened, Rob, is I used to brag about our ticket-splitting ways, the independent-minded North Dakotan that seizes a person for what he is, not because of the initial after his name, and makes a vote. I won elections in this Republican state for 30 consecutive years, if you count my legislative, state, and federal races. I couldn't get elected anything now. And I believe that this ticket-splitting ways of our past is at least temporarily past. And it really is... they call it skins and shirts. People are playing this like a ball game, and if you've got one jersey on, you're the guy. Or the woman. If you got the other jersey on, I'm not playing on that side. And I really think that's happened nationally. If you look at components of what make a Republican voter, they tend to be rural, tend to be religious, older. Not modest income. They describe an awful lot of the state's electorate that way. So I think that the Democrats had until we find a way to reconnect with this kind of tribal structure to our politics, it's a tough go. It's just a real tough go. And my thought to the party is they ought to really get back to trying to create an opportunity where an individual can run and win because he's talented, I use he, I mean he or she, because of talent and hard work, honesty, nice family, the kinds of things that you can't necessarily show. That's a harder to show when you don't have people coming along in the pipeline, having proven themselves in the neighborhoods and in the lower levels of government, coming along. So my goal for the Democrats, they make some headway. Let's get back to basics. Let's show our neighbors that we can do a good job. We care a lot about trying to make things better and try and pick up some of those local races, get that pipeline going again. Meanwhile, you've got the other side starting to show real fracture with traditional Republican versus the kind of the Trump type Republican. And I think this would be a bigger problem, Rob, than it is if the traditional Republicans were louder. They pretty well folded their tent for the Trumpers, in my view. You don't hear, you see Mitt Romney, you see the
at least
guy.
At least rhetorically. I mean, the one time where they really took action, I think, is the Luke Simons expulsion earlier this year. My reporting, exposed some of what was going on there, and they acted so swiftly it surprised me. I was expecting them to take a couple of weeks, and the next thing I know, like I start getting calls from people being like, "No, we're moving next week. We're gonna move to expel him." I was like, I think it was the right outcome, but I was, wow, that is fast, and that was sort of that became sort of a rallying cry for some of the what you described as the Trump aligned Republicans. In some of these district committee meetings, the reorgs and all that stuff that's kind of down in the weeds. But that's an interesting thing. I do think I have to take, because I got
to commend them for that expulsion. I would just you raise a point there. Yeah, they did the right thing on that one.
Yeah. To your point about why North Dakota Democrats can't get it, every time I talk to them, to somebody like Chad Oban is on the live stream with me regularly, former executive director of the party, and I talk to, believe it or not, I talk to a lot of Democrats, and I always hear that it's always, well, it's these national trends and everything else, and I don't know. I don't think you can explain, and as with anything, there's always a lot of different variables and a lot of different explanations. I really struggle with trying to find things that North Dakota Democrats talk about that I find worth voting for. And maybe I'm just a conservative and I'm not the one that they're going to peel off. But I don't know. I mean, to me, in a lot of ways, I don't know if you can ignore the idea that they're just not offering things that North Dakotans want to vote for.
They got dealt a really tough hand to play. And you might say they got a bad hand, they played it poorly. You might say they got a bad hand, they played it well, but they still have a really bad hand. And so I'm not going to, give a critique of the party. I think they're doing the best they can under extremely difficult circumstances. But I like the idea that all politics is local. It seems like we've gotten away from that a little, where all politics tends to be national.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's true.
I've got a brother-in-law on a county commission, and he faced a national issue as a county commissioner. What? A national issue to be a turn in Barnes County? Yeah. That's ridiculous. Well, they're the roads and culverts people.
Yeah, I have an example of this. We had a disputed primary in the treasurer's race on the Republican side in this last election cycle between Dan Johnston, who's the Bastiat Caucus Trump-aligned guy, who literally had Donald Trump endorse him in the treasurer's primary, right? I mean, how weird is that? So you had him versus Thomas Beadle, who I think is probably the more traditional Fargo Republican. And Beadle obviously ultimately won, but there's an example where Dan Johnston spent a lot of time talking about how his position on abortion. What does the Treasurer's Office do with regards to abortion? I mean, even if that's your issue and you care deeply about that issue, by law, the Treasurer's Office has nothing to do with abortion. But he's out there saying, I'm pro-life. Okay, great. I don't know why that matters, but you're pro-life. That's super, right? And I'm not belittling the issue. It's just, why did that matter in that race?
Well, I don't like the nationalization of these issues. There are important local issues. There are important issues in the treasurer's race. There's important issues at the most local, let's say the city commission race. Maybe there's a planning committee race. Think about the most local election you can think of. Well, there are important issues there. Let's talk about them honestly before the voters and let the voters decide where they want to go with things. Trying to confuse it by sounding like Tucker Carlson when you're running for the county commissioner, this is absurd. And it's unfortunate, I think, that's kind of where politics is right now.
Well, it's because in this past legislative session, I've been saying one of the most consequential bills, or I shouldn't say, because it wasn't just one bill, but one of the most consequential policy shifts we saw out of this legislative session was the move towards bonding. Now, not everybody's going to agree with that, but the idea that we have the legacy fund, for instance, this giant pile of money, and we can use that, not to spend it, but use it to backstop financing to make it so that we can build infrastructure in North Dakota faster and more cheaply. I think 15, 20 years from now, we're going to be able to draw a line from a lot of good things happening back to that decision, because I think it's a very, very smart thing. The thing is, building sewage plants and water lines is not sexy politics. What is sexy politics is, banning mask mandates. And that got all sorts of attention, right? Or the 10 Commandments in schools. Like this stuff doesn't really matter. It doesn't actually matter that much. But that's what everybody was talking about. And not the very consequential ponding bill. And again, that frustrated me. And I write about this stuff. I write about both things. And I can tell you which columns get more traffic. It ain't the ones about the sewage plants.
Well, I think that if there's your political leadership is trying to distract with these sensational issues, watch what they're really doing, because why aren't they putting front and center the job that they have in front of them? If you look back at the Bank of North Dakota, passed by the one time in the entire state where socialists controlled government, 1919. Why is it still around? It's been around through decades of Republican conservative leadership because they figured out a way to take this financing opportunity and leverage it through private sector ingenuity and create lending capacity that in our state that we otherwise wouldn't have. It's worked absolutely great. We're kind of the envy of 49 states with our bank and the way it's been used in partnership with private banks.
Yeah.
Okay, what about this bonding? You build a sewage plant, you got to post all the money up front. Well, the thing's going to last you 30 years. So, I think there's a nugget of wisdom in this bonding, as long as you don't let debt get out of hand, where you basically amortize the payment along the useful life of the asset. And so, I think if the legislature started down that road, maybe they accomplished something that makes sense. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think so, and but I mean that's the debate we could be having, and I think it's a much more fruitful debate than carrying on about masks. That just it completely.
You and I are nerds. I mean, that's the kind of stuff I love talking about.
Yeah,
that's why people run when they see me coming.
Yeah, I sometimes because I write for a living, so I get up from my desk and I walk back in my house. I'm complaining to my kids that you should see what I have to write about right now. This is what everybody's talking about. And I don't want to write about this because there's this really interesting thing they want to do with the sales tax, right? Like that's what I would rather be talking about, right? It's like, Dad, you big dork. Like I start talking about bonding and my kids' eyes roll back into their heads like, oh my God, what are you doing? I'm working on Memorial Day weekend because I'm reading something about taxes. That's you, dork. You're right. We're nerds. If only we had more nerds in politics. Well, Earl, I thank you so much for doing this with me. It's been a lot of fun, and we'll definitely have to do it again.
Yeah, count me in. I'll come up and do this again. I sure enjoyed being with you, Rob. Nice visit.
Thank you.
All right.